Hello everyone and welcome to the second video in my series of my Beatles singles collection. Now in today's video we'll mainly be looking at She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and those are the two singles that I have the most copies of, so that'll take up pretty much all of the video. I might get time to do Can't Buy Me Love at the end, but I'll have to see. Now, I'll start off with She Loves You. Now, this is actually the single I have the most copies of. In fact, I have 20 copies, if I remember rightly, but they aren't all different. But there are some, obviously, different variations in there. So, we'll begin with this very first one. So, here it is, on the black and silver Parlophone label. Still in the Parlophone sleeves. Now, this is a ever so slightly later Parlophone sleeve because on the bag here it has big Parlophone logo here and also an EMI logo, whereas the very slightly earlier ones just had the pound sign of the Parlophone logo. And if you can see the one in the background there, that one is a slightly earlier sleeve. And here's the B-side, I'll Get You, which is an absolutely amazing song. And by this time, all the credits are Lennon and McCartney. And this copy of the single also has an MKT tax code in the centre there, which is nice. So that's the first pressing of She Loves You there. And here is another copy of the exact same variation. Slightly better label on this one though, because the last one had a bit of damage. I'll take it out of its plastic sleeve so you can see it better. There it is. And here's side 2. Or the B side I should say. And this one also has an MKT tax code. Okay, now I'm going to attempt to show you an extremely minor variation between two different versions of the single. So on this version, I don't know how well you'll be able to see, the R in recording first published, so the very first R is underneath the X, but it's not entirely underneath the X. As you can see, it doesn't quite line up with sort of this end of the X. Now on the next single it will, so get ready for a very subtle change. Right, now on this variation, hopefully you'll be able to see that the R at the beginning of recording is now completely under the X, rather than only kind of partially underneath the X in 7XCE. So hopefully you'll be able to see that. As I say, it is extremely minor. Alright, so here's a better look at that second variation label here. So this is just basically a variation on the first one I showed you. So I would still say that this is the first press. Now I do have several duplicate copies of this variation, so I'll just get rid of those. So there go 3 duplicate copies. And I'll now move on to the next variation. So this copy here is actually the same as those duplicate copies, but I just want to highlight something so that you'll be able to see how it's changed on the single I'm about to show you. So here is the label. Now if we look at the gap between the perimeter text, which is all around here, this is the perimeter text, and the Northern Songs Limited 7XCE and recording first published. Now if we look at the gap in between those two, this little gap here, it's going to get a little bit smaller on the next single, okay? So watch closely for this. Right, so here is the next variation. Hopefully you can see that gap has shrunk a little bit. And here is the single itself, which is to all intents and purposes identical to the previous few copies. It's even still got the R in recording in the same place underneath the X in 7XCE, but it has a slightly smaller gap with the perimeter text. Now I am doing my best to show you all these tiny little variations, but if you feel like you still can't quite see them, let me know in the comment section and I'll try and improve it for the next video, okay? So anyway, this is just another duplicate copy. Yep. See how many more of these we've got. Yes, okay, so 2 more duplicate copies, and here is a different variation. Now, to show you the difference with this one, I'm just going to quickly go back to the previous variation. So here's a single like the one I've just shown you. So if we look closely at the Northern Songs Limited and the 7XCE 1395, sorry, 17395. Now, the gap in between the 7XCE and the Northern Songs Limited is about to get slightly bigger. Right, so here it is. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. The gap is ever so slightly larger. Now, there's something else I'd like to point out on this variation before I move on. Now, if we look at this section over here again, the 7 in 7XCE is very clearly beneath the S in songs. Now, on the variation I'm about to show you, the 7 will be right underneath the O in songs, okay? Right, so here it is, and hopefully you'll be able to see that the 7 is now directly underneath the O in songs rather than the S. Actually, one more thing I'd like to point out before moving on with this variation is that you can see that the gap beneath the Northern Songs Limited and the 7XCE is quite a lot bigger than the gap between the 7XCE and the recording first published. But on the next variation, they'll be more equally sized. Okay, so here's the next one. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see that the gap is a little bit more even in size between the Northern Songs and the 7XCE and the 7XCE in recording first published. Okay, so we now move on to the second present of She Loves You. Now, fortunately, you won't have to strain your eyes to actually notice the difference on this one. It is very obvious. And that is that it uses a completely different font. It's particularly noticeable on the Northern Songs and the 7XCE and the 17395 and the recording first published. That looks like it uses the Times New Roman font, whereas previous labels have used the sans serif font. So that looks completely different. And also, I forgot to mention on all copies that I've shown of it so far, the perimeter text only has certain letters that are capital, such as the T in the P in parlophone, the C in co, etc. Whereas now the perimeter text is all in capital letters. I get the camera to focus. There we go. So that's all in capital letters now. So that's another slight difference. Now, one thing I'd like to point out here is that the 7XCE is perfectly in line with the Northern Songs credit here. Perfectly in line. However, on the next pressing, that's going to change. So here's the next one. And if you look closely, you should be able to see that the 7XCE is now about a centimetre to the right, and so doesn't line up with the Northern Songs Limited. And there's also a much smaller gap between the information and the perimeter text as well. And here's just a duplicate copy of that variation. And here we come on to another version of She Loves You. Don't worry, we're almost finished with this single. Now, this one does actually have some obvious differences, so I'll bring it up. Now, the most striking difference about this one is that the She Loves You name there is in a much smaller font than the previous versions, which have all been nice and big at the bottom there. Same with the Beatles band name. But that's changed now, so it's smaller. And also, the information over on the left here has completely changed as well. This is the third pressing, by the way. And this is just a duplicate copy. And now on to my final copy of She Loves You. There is a slight difference. I'll just refer to the previous variation first though. So if we look here, when the camera focuses, there we go. The recording first published text more or less lines up perfectly with the L in limited. Now on the next variation, that will completely change position. So on this variation, as you can see, the recording first published is now much further to the left than it was before, so that it doesn't line up at all now with the Northern Songs Limited. Alright, so we are now out of the hell that is She Loves You. It's an absolute minefield, and I don't even have all the variations, but I've tried my best to show you the ones that I have, and I'm now going to move on to I Want to Hold Your Hand. Now I've got quite a few copies of this as well. I think I've got 13 copies of this, so we'll just get straight on with it. Right, so here is the Beatles' amazing single, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And this was their last single of 1963. And here's the B-side. Now, all pressings of I Want to Hold Your Hand came with the perimeter text in block capitals, so you won't need to look for ones which only have the first letter of the words in capitals for this one, because even the first pressings had it in block capitals. And here is a duplicate copy of that. However, I will just point out a feature I forgot to mention that will become relevant in a moment. If you look at the information over here, now the 7 in 7XCE lines up perfectly with the R in recording. Now that's about to change for the next variation. Now hopefully you'll be able to see that the 7 is now above the E in recording rather than the R, so it doesn't quite line up anymore. Now I've got a couple of duplicate copies of that one. Now for the next label variation, I'll just draw your attention to something from the previous version. The gap in between the 7XCE and the 17559 and the recording first published 1963 is about to shrink. So with a bit of luck you'll be able to see that the gap between that and indeed the Northern Songs Music Limited NCB credit have both become quite a bit smaller. Now here's a duplicate copy, however I would just like you to get a look at the push out centre on this. So take a good look at this push out centre, because the next pressing I'm about to show you is a Decca contract pressing, and the centre on that one will be totally different. So this is it on the conventional pressing, and here is the centre on the contract pressing. And you can always tell straight away if it's a contract pressing, because it'll have a centre that looks like this. However, there are contract presses which I'll be showing you in future videos which look different to this, but Decca contract pressings look like this. For some singles they're quite rare, and for some singles they're dead easy to get. And this isn't a rare one for I Want to Hold Your Hand, but it's still interesting to see. And here's the full single. In every other respect it's pretty much exactly the same as the conventional pressing. And here's the B-side, same there too. And I've got 4 more of pretty much the same there, so I'll just get rid of those. But one thing I will point out is that on pretty much every pressing I've shown you so far, if I Want to Hold Your Hand, just like this one, on the Northern Songs credit, the Songs is not in line with Northern, and it starts about halfway into Northern there, so the S is underneath the O. But that will significantly change with my final copy. So as you can see, the Northern and the Songs are now perfectly in line with each other. And this copy also has a very nice tax code. It's MPKT, I think it is. And this is not a tax code I see too many of, so it's nice to have one of these. Okay, so that concludes this week's video. Hopefully not every video will be so full of, tiny little variations. That's just what we were saddled with this week, just because I had so many copies of She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Now, one thing I will say is that although it can be quite interesting, please don't wreck your eyesight trying to collect every single variation. It's impossible. I'm sure there'll be an infinite number. I know, obviously having said that, I've tried my best. you know. But I'm not prepared to give up 20/20 vision in order to do it. You know, I don't really sit there on eBay looking for 10 minutes on each single to try and notice any differences. But you can see them really well in Bruce Spicer and Frank Daniels' book Beatles on Parlophone Records. It shows you it really well there, and that's pretty much where I've got all my information from this video from. So if you can get a hold of that, then it'll really help you. But anyway, that's the end of this week's video. I do hope you enjoyed this, and like I say, if you did have problems seeing some of these variations, please feel free to let me know, and I'll try my very best to show them better, or maybe be more selective about the variations I show in next week's video. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.